Hello, and welcome to my review of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the third in the series of recent games that began with Tomb Raider 2013, followed by Rise of the Tomb Raider in 2015. While these two games were developed by Crystal Dynamics, Shadow has been crafted by Eidos Montreal, with the studios working together to ensure that the game feels like a continuation of the series. Shadow of the Tomb Raider released on the 14th of September 2018 and is published by Square Enix. The game will be assessed on the following general criteria: narrative, gameplay, presentation, audio, and technical. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a third-person action-adventure puzzle game, with more of a focus on puzzles than the last two entries in the series. Here, combat takes a back seat and prioritises stealth over all-out action. As in all Tomb Raider games, you play as Lara Croft, a young, aristocratic Englishwoman with a passion for archaeology, driven by a need to continue her father's work after his mysterious death. The game is a direct continuation of the previous two titles, taking place some months after the events of Rise. Many familiar gameplay elements return from prior titles, but Shadow is definitely its own game, and does a decent job of concluding Lara's origin story, setting her up for more adventures in the future. The story picks up in Mexico, where Lara and her tough but sensitive partner Jonah are searching for an ancient artifact guided by her late father's notes. This artifact is one of two devices of Mayan design which together will allow whoever controls them to remake the world. Those who have played the early Assassin's Creed games will notice some similarities here. The Trinity, the villainous organisation from the previous game, return as the antagonists, who are of course looking for the aforementioned artifact as well. The story soon takes Lara to Peru, and unfolds as a chase that sees Lara trying to reach her objective before Trinity, aided by a tribal cultist faction, who attempt to impede her progress at every turn. The story is basic and not particularly involving for the player, with predictable beats, and concludes with a boss fight in an arena that does not play to the combat system's strengths at all. Furthermore, the mystery surrounding the death of Lara's father and her obsession with carrying on his work is touched on at the start and then never again until it is brought up near the finale. This is a shame, as I would have liked more of a reason for Lara to be going on this adventure rather than simply stop the bad guys. Being a Tomb Raider game, the focus is of course on Lara herself, and this game makes an effort to show that her character has evolved from the more timid and naive persona we saw in previous titles. Instead, Shadow presents us with a more seasoned adventurer, with her muscles now toned to reflect her athletic prowess. In fact, Lara sometimes comes across as a stone-cold killer, a far cry from the infamous First Kill in 2013's entry. Lara is once again played by Camilla Luddington, who continues to do a convincing job of portraying this legendary video game protagonist. Her performance is nuanced, with tone and expression appropriate to each scene and conversation topic. Despite being British-born and having an extremely English name, Camilla has lived in the United States for the last decade, and this has influenced her accent somewhat. For example, she says progress when she should say progress, among a few other slip-ups. However, this is a small quibble, and non-British players will likely not notice at all. Lara's Polynesian travelling companion, Jonah, returns in a greater capacity than prior titles, and I enjoyed the performance once again given by Earl Balon, who acts as Lara's voice of reason. While Lara is separated from Jonah for much of the game, they do spend a lot of time exploring as a pair, and it is refreshing for Lara to have someone to talk to in person as she makes her way through the jungle. The only other two characters of note are the main villain and the leader of a rebel faction that you encounter when you arrive in the village of Paititi. The two characters have a history, and this is explored to a small extent, but neither of these characters are particularly well fleshed out, and their impact on the story is lessened as a result, since the player is unable to become invested in these newcomers. There is a small supporting cast, but these are relegated to henchmen or quest givers with little to learn about them. As with many games of this nature, the environment is the star of the show, leaving many of the human characters in its shadow. Something that I do need to mention is that the inhabitants of the supposedly hidden ancient village of Paititi all speak perfect English with light Hispanic accents. They do have a native tongue, but this is rarely heard, and characters will often communicate with one another in English even when Lara is not within earshot. I know this is done for convenience, but there was a moment where this really stuck out. A young boy in the village is speaking to Lara and asks what the world outside Paititi is like. This shows that this 12-year-old boy has not only never left Peru, but has never even left his isolated tribal village. Yet, despite no contact with the outside world, he can speak perfect English. I feel that with Lara's natural aptitude for ancient languages, more could have been made of her trying to communicate with these people as an outsider, slowly but surely learning to communicate with them as she earns their trust. This may have slowed down the plot, but Lara could have been a quick learner, grasping the language based on her existing knowledge of Mayan, Incan, and Peruvian culture. Shadow of the Tomb Raider offers a lot of enjoyment over the course of its fairly lengthy single-player campaign, with the chance for players to finish discovering challenge tombs and collectibles after the end of the story. The game is well-paced, featuring some challenging puzzles and combat scenarios that offer a wealth of options, and the gameplay is broken up by frequent visits to Paititi. This hidden village in Peru is a large space to explore, speak to NPCs, and obtain side quests, which are more fleshed out than in Rise. The detail on display here is impressive, and while there are NPCs who are more static, there are plenty that perform tasks, such as repairing structures or playing with their children in the river. The environment is believable as a result of the effort the developers have put into creating such a vibrant and lived-in space. Combat sequences are few and far between in Shadow, and this is a welcome shift for me personally, as I felt the combat in the prior titles was sometimes forced and out of place. Here, combat almost always begins with stealth, and Lara is far more hunter than prey this time around. She has new abilities at her disposal that favour the silent approach, and the environments have been designed accordingly. Murder Grass returns, of course, but new to the series are Murder Walls, as I call them, which allow Lara to approach targets while hidden by vines, roots and leaves, brandishing her combat knife for a silent takedown. The stealth kill range is a little generous, and the enemies appear to teleport into position for the appropriate animation to begin. This same phenomenon can be seen in the recent Deus Ex titles, also developed by Eidos Montreal. When combat does heat up, either as a result of a botched attempt at stealth or as part of the bombastic set pieces that punctuate the story, the game makes use of the same contextual cover system seen in 2013 and Rise. Enemies will flank you and throw grenades to flush you out, so the player is encouraged to stay moving. It is possible to lose line of sight and return to stealth, but this is difficult in the smaller combat arenas that were clearly designed for Lara to remain hidden. Guns feel powerful, especially when fully upgraded, and there are different weapon variants that can be equipped, with Lara gaining access to different options as she progresses through the story. Puzzles are satisfyingly challenging and ambitious in scale and quantity. These are some of the best puzzles in the series, with the challenge tombs in particular representing a crowning achievement in environmental puzzle design. One puzzle that did frustrate me slightly was the relatively simple one at the conclusion of a flashback sequence. The penultimate step was not at all obvious and made little sense to me, yet the remainder of that sequence was beautiful and I enjoyed exploring Croft Manor. In fact, since this sequence features many traversal elements used later in the game, I think this would have made an excellent tutorial at the very start of the game. Shadow also has a rather welcome approach to difficulty settings, in that the difficulties for exploration, puzzles and combat can all be tweaked to suit your needs. Each aspect can be set to easy, medium, hard, or very hard, allowing for dozens of combinations. For example, a player could set exploration to medium, puzzles to very hard, and combat to easy if they just wanted to breeze through combat encounters to get to the next challenge tomb. It's a good system, and one that caters to a variety of players with the option to select a predefined and consistent difficulty still present. Since I primarily play games on PC, I will be referring to the PC controls in this next section. As you would expect from a polished Nix's PC port, all controls are remappable in the options menu. However, I did find it odd that the mouse and keyboard section of the menu only offers mouse settings, and the keyboard actually has its own key mapping menu all to itself. While the key binding settings are easily found, it is not where you might expect. The controls are well bound by default for the most part, although it does bind consumable items to the first 4 function keys, which I tend to avoid whenever possible, as they are quite far out of the way. However, I rarely found myself needing to use these items throughout my time with the game. While the mapping is functional, the same cannot be said for the way the controls work in-game. The primary issue is that being a third-person game, Lara's movement is controlled exclusively by the WASD keys, which unlike an analog stick, only allow for 8 possible directions. In first-person games, the mouse can be used to fine-tune movements from that perspective, but in third-person it only controls the camera. This, combined with some awkward timings in certain traversal animations, meant that Lara mistakenly jumped off a ledge or simply failed to make what should have been an easy jump, despite the appropriate keys being pressed. This was the cause of almost all my deaths in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, as I only died a handful of times in combat on medium difficulty. To make matters worse, these environmental deaths meant that I had to sit through the same gruesome death animation before the checkpoint reloaded. The nature of third-person games is a limiting factor here, but the wobbly climbing and jumping animations add to an already tricky control implementation. For this reason, I tend to play third-person games using a controller on PC. Shadow is undoubtedly the most visually ambitious Tomb Raider game to date, and while not a huge technological leap over Rise, improvements have been made to character models and lighting effects that really help to create an immersive environment. There is a stunning contrast between the bright open vistas and the dark, mysterious depths of the thick Peruvian jungle. The foliage has a believable density, and the level of detail in the geometry is impressive. The dynamic tessellation seen in Rise returns here, but in place of the thick snow is mud, and Lara can wade through it, carving out a path while leaving a watery trench in her wake. It looks fantastic. Lara herself looks particularly lifelike, with rosier skin than before, and her facial animation helps to bolster an already stunning performance. Lara is also the only character model to feature a huge number of pores in her skin, adding to her realism. NPCs are generally of high quality, but when compared to Lara's immaculately modelled and shaded face, the quality difference is noticeable, especially in cutscenes. The cutscenes as a whole are beautifully crafted, with a strong depth of field effect focusing the player's attention on the characters. I particularly enjoyed the camera work in the game, especially when trapped in a narrow space, which sees the camera carefully work its way around the rocks and obstacles, while Lara slowly and desperately crawls her way to safety. Another area that deserves praise is the underwater sections, where the lighting from the surface reacts realistically to the movement of the water, and goes a long way towards creating a convincing caustic effect. This is even evident in a water feature at the start of the game, in a scene that really showcases the game's stunning lighting. The only area that stops Shadow from being truly jaw-dropping on PC is the texture quality. Despite running the game on its highest possible settings and with 8GB of VRAM to throw at it, the Ultra texture setting was still a mixed bag. Shadow is a 30GB package, which is relatively small for a modern AAA game, and I would assume that this is down to the texture files being identical to the Xbox One X version. With this in mind, after completing the story, I decided to run the game in 4K on my PC with a 30fps cap, and was blown away by the improvement in visual quality. The increased resolution certainly helps to clear up the edges of tessellated geometry, and definitely disguises the lower res textures. Armed with this knowledge, I almost wished I had played the game like this from the start. I firmly believe, based on my experience, that the game was built for the Xbox One X, and while the PC port is a good one, it uses exactly the same assets which were designed to be played at a native 4K resolution on a TV, where texture quality isn't as much of an issue when you are not sitting close to the screen. The graphics options are broad and boast some features that are not present on consoles. Many of these visual effects can be toned down or disabled entirely to provide a frame rate boost. There are also some very nice anti-aliasing solutions included, which you can select depending on your hardware and preference. The game also features a photo mode, although this is rather basic and has a heavily restricted camera. While you are able to control the viewing angle during most gameplay sequences after pausing the game, there are some animations that are locked in and restricts the photo mode to a single camera angle. As photo modes go, this is on the weaker side, but can still capture beautiful shots if you have a good eye for photography. The UI in Shadow continues the minimalist style established in 2013, with barely any information appearing on the screen during gameplay. In fact, the UI actively hides itself whenever possible so as not to intrude on the immersive exploration portions of the game. It does appear during gameplay if Survivor Sense is activated, which returns as Tomb Raider's answer to Batman's detective vision or Geralt's Witcher senses. This highlights objectives and parts of the environment that are useful to Lara, but is heavily toned down if exploration and puzzle difficulties are set higher. The UI shows its face at campfires, where Lara can upgrade her gear, unlock skills, and change her outfit. The UI elements seen here are almost identical to the previous games, and show Lara's model in real time as she strikes poses with each weapon as you upgrade them, before sitting herself back down beside the fire. This is a nice way of embedding the upgrade menus in the world, where you can feel connected to Lara while she takes a break before continuing her journey. The sound in Shadow marks a high point for the series, and the setting lends itself to an immersive soundscape. Since Lara finds herself surrounded by thick jungle much of the time, it is a relief that the rustling of foliage, the squawks of birds, and the movement of animals in the undergrowth are all present, and mostly correct. I experienced animal calls being played loudly in one ear as if the source of the sound was right next to me, but there was no creature in sight. Directional sound and volume for character dialogue was actually very inconsistent throughout the game, and I noticed that some NPCs would be talking loudly as if they were right next to Lara, when they were actually separated by a thick stone wall. I particularly enjoyed walking through Paititi and listening to the different sounds of the village as residents went about their business, with idle conversation, children's laughter, running water and wildlife all thrown into the mix. Material-based sound samples work very well, and there is a distinct transition between running on a wooden bridge and walking through muddy puddles. Weapons sound loud, with an appropriate level of depth and variation between the different guns. The bow has a satisfying snap as it is fired, followed by a thud when the arrow strikes home. Sound effects are definitely exaggerated, but these are sounds that convey context to help gameplay. For example, when Lara is perched on a tree branch, she will draw her knife when an enemy is approaching her aerial takedown range, so that the player knows to keep an eye out below her. This looks as awesome as it sounds.
Anything? Quiet. I need to hear.
Shadow uses music subtly, and in so doing, makes it very effective at conveying the desired mood. The score varies between mournful strings, heavy tribal drums, and a more innocent and upbeat theme that accompanies a flashback scene showing Lara's childhood. The score is composed by Brian D'Oliveira, who does an excellent job of blending instruments and musical styles that are appropriate to the setting. As Lara progresses further into caves, tombs, and puzzle chambers, the music becomes more intense, with drums pounding along to your heartbeat, especially when you encounter a new enemy faction halfway through the game. Music is also used to aid progress in puzzles and challenge tombs, with a sound cue playing to indicate that a required step has been taken by the player and that they are on the right track. The strings are used to great effect during the quieter moments of the game, providing some accompaniment to the more important moments that would otherwise be devoid of sound. The consistent performance of Shadow deserves a lot of praise, and we can thank Dutch porting house Nixes for their excellent work in bringing the game to PC. With ultra settings at 1080p with a GTX 1080 and an i7 at 4.4 GHz, Shadow was easily reaching 90 FPS in most areas, only dropping to the 50s in the most demanding and crowded spaces. For a game with GPU-heavy features like ambient occlusion, tessellation, and volumetric lighting, its performance was rock solid on my machine and is very scalable across PC hardware. I did experience minor hitching and stutter in moments where the game was loading during gameplay, but this was likely due to the game being installed on my slowest hard drive. However, a friend of mine who also has the game on PC reported a similar problem, so your experience may vary. Thanks to the excellent PC port, I found very few bugs in the game. The only issues I had were relating to traversal, with Lara appearing to vibrate while hanging from a ledge. This is likely down to the complexity of the environments and the occasional ledge that isn't programmed correctly. I do not believe the aforementioned control issues can be counted as bugs, as I really think they are just a combination of poorly implemented animations and awkward keyboard inputs, and the score for the control section has already been adjusted to reflect that. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a solid adventure game with sufficient content to be worth your time. Upon completing the story and a handful of tombs and side quests, I was at 60% completion to give you an idea of how much more there is to see and do. Rest assured that there are entire areas of the game that are not part of the story and can only be accessed by exploring off the beaten path. You will like this game if you enjoyed the other recent Tomb Raider games or the Uncharted series, which owes much of its success to the original Tomb Raiders. However, Shadow does not reach the lofty bar set by Uncharted 4, lacking the intimate, personal storytelling, charismatic cast, and slick platforming. Ultimately, too much of what Shadow of the Tomb Raider does has been done before, and done better, by other games. It combines these elements in an effective way, but it is not the trendsetter that the series once was. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is available to buy on PC through Steam, and on the PS4 and Xbox One. Its launch price is £45 or $60, but this will drop depending on how long it has been since the time of recording. I gave Shadow of the Tomb Raider a score of 78% overall, and my scoring model is on the screen now so you can see the breakdown of the score for each section. Every section has a different weighting depending on their importance. I hope you enjoyed this review, and remember to leave a like and subscribe to my channel to see more. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.